Good morning, everyone. We are so glad to have you this morning. We're going to give folks just a few minutes here to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Good morning. We're going to give folks just another few seconds to get into our webinar before we get started this morning. We're glad to see you. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth module in our six-part series on adapting or adopting high-quality instructional materials. We are excited to dig in today around reading language arts. And before we do that, a quick reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the Strong Start page on TEA's website. We're going to go ahead and put the link to that website in the chat right now. And then we're also going to ask that you use the Q&A feature of the webinar to ask questions so that we can be sure that they're answered during the appropriate time later on. And for those of you who have been at our previous webinars, many of these faces might look familiar. For those of you just joining us today, my name is Kelsey Hendricks, and I'm the Senior Director of Custom Services at Instruction Partners. I'm joined today by our Director of ELA, Christina Gonzalez, our Managing Director of Instructional Support for our Texas partners, Brian Hearn, and our Executive Director of District Partnerships, Jabari Sim. And as each of you know, our current reality is one that is totally unprecedented. As a result, we are tasked with really reimagining how we can leverage high quality instructional materials. Your teams and your leaders will also have to be really nimble and ready to adjust instruction at a moment's notice across remote and in-person learning scenarios in the fall. And as a result of that current reality, we know that teachers and leaders across Texas are asking two major questions. One, how do I make sure that all of my students experience high quality, TEKS-aligned instruction, regardless of their learning environment or their level of connectivity? And two, how do I accomplish that task without seeing all or some of my students in person every day? Our six-part series seeks to share with systems how they might actually support teachers in answering those questions. Today, we're in our fourth module with our prior webinars focused on determining whether to adapt your current materials or adopt new high-quality instructional materials, and then sharing more specifically about how you might go about doing that for pre-K and for math. And our webinar today is focused on considerations for adoption and adaptation for ELAR K-12 and SLAR K-6. We're going to use the term RLA throughout our series today to refer to them collectively. Today, we will identify quality considerations for adoption of curricula for RLA and prioritize considerations for adaptation, as we then will engage in a case study around adapting materials for remote instruction. As you all know, we are not in a typical summer right now, and we normally wouldn't even be talking about adopting or even adapting your curriculum at the beginning of August, but know that this is a conversation that we are having because of COVID and the need to have instruction that can be used in remote and in-person settings. I also want to note that the beginning portion of this webinar is not going to be focused on Texas Home Learning 3.0 specifically. After we go through key considerations for adopting and adapting high quality instructional materials in RLA, TEA will be able to share an overview of THL 3.0 for RLA and then hold specific time at the end of our session for questions related to THL. And again, before we dive in here, you'll be able to access the recording from this session along with modules 1, 2, and 3 on TEA's Strong Start resources page. We've placed the link in the chat and we'll do that one more time so that you have it at hand. In our time together today, we're really going to think specifically about the following questions. 1, what are we going to teach in RLA? How will we ensure that all students can access grade level complex text and engage in repeated readings of text? And also, how are we going to ensure that foundational literacy practices happen in accordance with HB3? We're also going to be thinking about how we integrate the 7 strands of the TEKS with grade level complexity and nuance. And finally, how are we going to adjust to remote learning and teaching? How will we prioritize our face-to-face time with students? And how are they going to engage in if they're not in a classroom together? And we know from the TEKS literacy principles that the recursive nature and intentional redundancy that are threaded throughout the ELAR and SLAR TEKS allows teachers to prioritize grade level content and instructional rigor during reentry and address unfinished learning as it arises naturally. Knowing the TEKS literacy principles, as I'm sure many of you already do, and you can see them here on the screen, can help you really recognize whether or not your curricular materials align with teaching TEKS in a meaningful way. I'm going to give you a moment to read through the principles that you can see here on the screen. The interconnectedness of the newly revised TEKS can really be seen in this graphic. Foundational skills are the roots of early reading and writing, allowing students to access the printed word and translate the sounds of spoken language to written language. As such, what teachers need to know, do, and believe in this strand are really the touchstone of the TEKS. The knowledge and skills across the remaining TEKS underscore the importance of putting text at the center of instruction. The TEKS emphasizes the need for students to know a text really deeply. In other words, it's not simply enough to know what a main idea is without also knowing how it is revealed by a particular author in a particular text and in a particular genre. And the research also tells us that the structure of RLA is not a collection of discrete skills. As Timothy Shanahan, a researcher at the University of Chicago, reminds us, that questions or standards specifically about the things like purpose, tone, main idea, they're all fine, but they're not really repeatable because each text and the expression of each text is so different. And what it takes to really identify or construct a main idea is going to greatly vary from text to text. Throughout our conversation today about how we engage in adopting high quality instructional materials for RLA or adapting high quality instructional materials to meet the needs of remote learning, we're really going to be grounded in this idea of the text. And with that, I'm going to transition it over to my colleague Jabari, who will share more about how the structure of RLA impacts the key considerations for quality in RLA materials adoption.
Thank you, Kelsey, and good morning to everyone out there. I hope that you're doing well. In thinking, if we could advance to the next slide, in thinking about adoption, we must start with high quality instructional materials. That is really going to be essential. If we rewind back to our very first module, we discussed just how important it is that we ground ourselves in a common definition of high quality instructional materials. On our screen, in a second, you'll see a helpful checklist that can be used to evaluate your current curriculum and meet the needs of remote learning. Those high quality instructional materials, they must include first, the materials have to be TEKS aligned content. Second, in order to meet all of our students' needs, they must support all learners, including students with disabilities and emerging bilingual students. Third, support for content connections. Built-in progress monitoring. And fifth, support for educators, including support for unfinished learning. These are really the 5 components that are at the heart of all high quality instructional material, regardless of context. And to really maximize student learning, given our current context, materials must also include usability, both on campus and in a virtual remote setting, and usability and additional supports for families. A high quality curriculum addresses all of these requirements, and those last 2 are really most critical right now. High quality instructional materials can solve for the many challenges faced in the spring. One challenge that we heard from educators across the state of Texas was that teachers who were developing their own curriculum had a difficult time adjusting to remote learning this spring. And we see on the right, high quality instructional materials alleviate the burden of designing lessons so that teachers can focus more on how to adapt their curriculum to work both in person and remotely. They can also better support students with diverse needs. A second challenge was that leaders needed to navigate multiple sets of resources to support teachers. And we see here on the right that high quality instructional material can make it easier for principals and coaches to support teachers despite the changing scenarios for teaching and learning. And finally, probably most important, a third challenge is that schools are relying on groups of adults for an unprecedented amount of student support, care, and guidance. And high quality instructional materials can provide that consistency and the predictability for those supporting students while teachers remain the core instructors. So we asked back in Module 1 whether or not it makes sense to really adopt or adapt, and we'll see as we dig deeper in adoption that it's truly deeply content specific. So let's talk about what adoption looks like for reading language arts. First, we start with alignment to ELAR and SLAR TEKS. Next, every district wants lots of time and text for students, right? Districts must ensure the materials require students to spend the majority of time engaged with high quality, grade level text with a variety of genres, lengths, and purposes. And the materials should provide multiple opportunities for content and instructional concepts. Take a minute to look at how your materials should include multiple interactions with and in response to text. They're listed here. And finally, districts must ensure supports for all learners, answering the key question: are there built-in supports to ensure all students, including students with special needs and emerging bilingual students, can access grade level content? Now, those considerations just shared apply whether you're adopting ELAR or SLAR materials, and listed here are additional considerations for bilingual programs. I especially want to highlight point 2, which calls for flexible implementation modes, and point 3, where there is explicit instruction and guidance that is authentic to the Spanish language and encourages cross-linguistic transfer. As you're deciding on adopting curriculum, the Texas Resource Review might be helpful to you. Here's a screenshot of what it might look like. And you see here, they're comparing 2 different curriculum. Now, typically, we probably would not be thinking about adopting new material in early August, but we all know that these are not typical times right now. The reality is that there needs to be a strong plan for what will be best for all of our students in the fall, which will require some really difficult and time-sensitive decisions that you wouldn't normally take. To support for reading language arts, you can turn to the TEKS resource review. In this example, you see it provides detailed, comprehensive, and user-friendly information about the quality of instructional materials using a Texas-specific quality rubric. Content-rich, grade-level complex text is really at the center of high-quality instructional materials in reading language arts. If we start from the right and then grow to the left, you see what's always been important in reading language arts is especially important now. Whether school starts back with students learning in buildings, remotely, or through hybrid offerings, each student needs to be engaged in the work of complex grade-level text. And all students become proficient through deliberate practice, which means, like I like to say, many miles on the page, reading it repeatedly, right? Combined with well thought out questions to assist in that understanding of text, and plenty of opportunities to express their meaning and importance through speaking and writing along the way. It's really a text-centered approach that builds towards the confident and joyful readers that we really want to see in all of our students. The material should also include a high-quality phonics program. House Bill 3 requires all districts and charters certify 3 reading practices, one of which is the use of a phonics program that uses systematic direct instruction in kindergarten to 3rd grade to ensure all students obtain necessary early literacy skills. The material should have a systematic phonics approach which encourages or ensures that the concepts are planned in a careful order that builds in skill complexity in quick, structured lessons and incorporates the use of progress monitoring along the way. The skills, as you see here, should also be taught explicitly. For example, the skill is taught through demonstration and modeling with opportunities for students to practice and then receive feedback. This ensures that phonics skills are not left to chance because our youngest students will be learning to read across multiple instructional environments. Continuity is going to be key and essential to ensuring that they are engaged in a high quality phonics program. You see here, as we're thinking about adopting high quality instructional phonics program, here are all the materials and look-fors that we want to make sure are found. Take a minute to just read through what they might include. Understanding the tenets of high quality reading language arts curriculum becomes especially important if there's a shift to distance learning. It's important to maintain the integrity of high quality instructional materials even in a distance learning scenario. Here are the key considerations. We want to prioritize our TEKS. We want to think, how will those TEKS be prioritized? And do some TEKS need a stronger emphasis in time and effort than others? Students need access to high quality text, be it hard copies, digital copies from the publisher, or online from another source. Then we think about content and instructional concepts. What opportunities, we might be thinking, what opportunities might be provided for student discourse, even if it's virtually? And how to ensure students engage in repeated reading of grade level text, work with textual evidence, discern deeper meaning, and write recursively. And finally, what scaffolds can be provided so that all students can access grade level appropriate text in a distance learning scenario? I think it's important to note the key distinctions for pre-K to 2 as attendance funding is only available for asynchronous learning. you should be thinking specifically about the fact that while teachers will remain the primary instructors, families and caregivers will play an increased role. And as a result, consideration must also be given to caregiver capacity to support our youngest readers when selecting foundational literacy materials. As district leaders, these are all going to be very important decisions for adopting that will have real implications for all students across Texas. I want to leave you with this suggested action steps that you might take for adoption. Now, in a normal year, you might start with the blue, which includes forming a selection team and determining how a decision might be made, and then mapping out a timeline of the review to adoption and collecting input from multiple stakeholders. Given that we're in a less than ideal reality right now, we have to make some modifications. So given that extremely short timeline you're operating under, the actions that are in the orange boxes are the ones that you can really zoom in on at this moment. They're the most urgent and also the highest impact. And they include doing a complete review of those materials, making sure they're aligned to the high quality instructional material checklist that we mentioned, deciding what to adopt, and then organizing your next steps and communication plan from there. And keeping in mind in Module 6, we'll discuss how to implement whatever you've decided to adopt. So I'm going to transition it over to Christina, who's going to share more about adapting. I talked about adopting. She's going to talk about adapting for instructional quality, coherence, and continuity.
Thanks, Jabari. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. Now that you've had a chance to think about what you might look for in adopting high quality instructional materials, we're going to think about what it might look like if you decide to adapt your existing materials. Knowing that this upcoming school year is going to present challenges around planning for the unknown, maybe expecting ongoing closures and planning for remote settings, we know you're going to be having to make swift decisions a lot. We've prioritized key actions to consider when you think about adapting high quality RLA materials to meet the needs of these planning constraints that you're going to face. The first thing you're going to do is to complete an inventory of the instructional days that are available to you and to understand how many days you're truly planning for so that you can begin to prioritize the units in the curriculum materials and the TEKS. Secondly, you're going to prioritize the text within those units and then determine the plan for unfinished learning, and then align those materials to the appropriate instructional setting, whether it's virtual or in-school learning. And then finally, ensure that all students have access to appropriate scaffolds, whether that's in a synchronous learning environment or an asynchronous learning environment. Again, as Jabari said and Kelsey said, we know in an ideal world, we would not be talking about adapting your curriculum materials on August 3rd. However, we do want to share how we might go through the thinking process to make these adaptations so that your district can account for these considerations as you make these difficult decisions in this unprecedented school year. So what we're going to do is look at how this might play out in a district in Texas if you decided to adapt your curriculum materials instead of adopt. So let's say that District A is a mid-sized urban district with a bilingual program for K-5 and a significant ESL population. The district adopted high quality material in 3-5 ELAR last year with the adoption cycle and the new TEKS. And they've decided to adapt their materials this year and are concerned about adapting for anticipated rolling closures and possible learning loss from last year's COVID closures. So in this case study, we'll use specific examples from the materials in this Texas district, as all of the decisions that you make are also going to be grounded in the context of the specific texts that are tied to the curriculum you're using locally. So our goal in this case study is to use this specific example to provide you with the insight and the thinking process and considerations that your district might use as you complete a similar process for adapting your materials. Before I walk you through this model, I want to name up front that you are the people that are going to make these difficult decisions. And while we are not the individuals who answer these challenging questions at a system level, we do work in close partnership with many districts such as yours. So as I narrate through this decision process, I want you to imagine that I'm your district's RLA curriculum director. So we have a high quality curriculum in our district. I'm your district's curriculum director, and the current high quality instructional material we use include 4 units per year. I know that the current reality likely means that there will not be enough time to complete all 4 units, and that even the best high quality instructional materials were not designed specifically for this moment in time. So as I begin to make decisions at the system level to plan for these challenges, the first thing I'm thinking about is how long I have in the instructional year. We reviewed our calendar and found that we had enough instructional days to cover a little more than 3 units. We know we want to focus on the depth of instruction rather than the pace, and know that some of the units will take longer in a distance learning scenario. We decide that we need to omit 1 unit to open up space for addressing unfinished learning, so that we can spend more time on fewer texts, and so that students can work flexibly through changing learning environments. We considered these 3 questions. What is the knowledge story for each of the 4 units in our curriculum? How can I maintain diversity across the grade level and genres, authors, and subjects? And how do I ensure that the modules are rich in scientific, historical, and literary content and vocabulary? In this case, we decided to omit Unit 1, the C, because there are 2 scientific units in this grade level, and also because it would have minimal impact on shifting the TEKS to other units to make sure that all of the TEKS are covered. We also wanted to make sure we considered SLAR, and in this case, we previously adopted a parallel set of materials from the same vendor, so the same considerations can also apply for adaptation for SLAR materials. Once we determined the units and the standards, we thought about how we would ensure that there's enough time in each unit to truly cover the depth of the TEKS, and time to focus on some of those skills we know that students might need additional time with. So here we had to get pretty specific about which text we were going to teach. We have to really take into account the full story of the unit to determine which texts are the highest priority. In Unit 2, the knowledge story is about outer space and how both artists and scientists wonder about space. Students extend their critical reading skills by exploring how authors organize complex ideas in informational text. They also compare and contrast how different authors present information about the same topic. And students learn to distinguish their own point of view from that of the author. So if I consider the purpose of each text in the unit, Zathra feels like a text that could be eliminated while still keeping the knowledge story intact and maintaining a range of authors and perspectives. Zathra is the only literary text in the unit, but it just doesn't connect as tightly to the story that the unit is building. There will be 3 core informational texts left: Moonshot, One Giant Leap, and Starry Messenger, but all 3 are narrative in nature. So if we omit Zathra, we could still ensure that anything lost from that text is gained in the remaining 3. The time will be focused on the remaining 3 prioritized texts in the unit. And again, because we've adopted parallel materials from the same vendor, for SLAR, the same considerations can apply for adaptation there. The next thing I want to do is consider unfinished learning. We've given the nature of the RLA TEKS with the intentional redundancies built in, we wanted to really think how we might leverage time and how we could support teachers in decision making. We decided that we needed to be able to share with teachers on the front end where to invest their time and effort, what areas can be cut, and where they should teach only to the awareness level to save time for priorities. With this unit, that meant giving additional time to the TEKS Starry Night to prioritize time for student discussions, scaffolding for this complex text, some small group instruction, and fluency practice. What's most important deserves the most time, and we want teachers to have the latitude to provide responsive feedback to students and allow for time for productive struggle, a very different proposition than merely offering students a superficial right or wrong. And this additional time has to come from somewhere. So eliminating Zathra opens up space to build out that additional time in the pacing guide for Starry Messenger, which will likely need more background building, vocabulary work, and fluency practice. And it also opens up time to build in abundant opportunities for students to discuss the text or the teacher to provide scaffolds to mitigate text complexities, for students to express their thinking about the text, and for the small group instruction to happen, whether it be in person or virtually. Finally, we need to think about at a system level, we might need to suggest content and learning that can be prioritized for synchronous instruction versus asynchronous instruction. As a district, we also consider at this point our bilingual program. We want to ensure that our students are receiving the appropriate amount of instruction in each language, regardless of the learning environment. So we put together an example of some practices better suited for synchronous learning. And I want to highlight here for you K-3 foundational skills. They will always, we know, for our youngest learners, be better suited for synchronous learning. So when we can make that happen, that would be excellent. And then some examples of practices that might be better suited for asynchronous learning. Teachers can do read alouds on recordings or videos for students. We can give caregivers guidance around fluency practices. So these are just some examples of RLA practices that could be suited for synchronous learning versus asynchronous learning, and some guidance at a system level that we might be able to give to teachers so they can align their instruction to the appropriate instructional setting. And finally, we need to think about how to provide access to appropriate scaffolds so that all of our students can access that grade level complex text. And then we need to determine which one of those scaffolds we can leverage asynchronously and which are better used synchronously. For example, if we think about the space unit, providing short articles or a video around outer space to help students build background knowledge can be done asynchronously, but asking a sequence of questions to engage students deeply with the text might be better done in a synchronous learning environment. So as we think about this unit at a system level, these are some options we thought about for providing appropriate scaffolds during asynchronous learning. Short articles and videos. For emerging bilingual students, videos with closed captioning capability. Meeting with small groups of students outside the whole group. And these are some scaffolds that we might suggest to teachers for synchronous learning environment. During the outer space unit, daily fluency practice from Starry Night, for which the teacher will have already modeled speed and accuracy, chunking the text into short passages, and leveraging small formative assessments are all things that might happen better in a synchronous learning environment so that all of our students can access grade level complex text. Once again, we know in an ideal world, we wouldn't be talking about these types of adaptations in early August. However, we do want you to feel as confident as possible as you find your school system's path forward. As you make these unprecedented decisions, at the forefront of your decision making should be the heart of all RLA content and the heart of the TEKS, which is grade level complex text in front of all students, and providing the necessary support, whether it's in a virtual learning space or in a classroom, so that all students can access those grade level TEKS. So just a summary of the steps that we just went through to make adaptations to the unit around space, and suggestions we might make at the system level to help teachers with that. Prioritizing the unit and the TEKS, prioritizing the text within that unit, determining our plan for students who have unfinished learning, thinking about the appropriate instructional setting and the impact that might have, and then ensuring that our students have, all of our students have access to the appropriate scaffolds that they need so that they can all access grade level complex text. I'm going to hand it off now to my colleague, Brian, who's going to talk to you now about if moving forward with adaptations is the path that your school system chooses to use, how can you operationalize those adaptations?
Thanks, Christina. Let's take a look at this chart, and this chart outlines for each one of the action steps what a district could do in terms of assigning the action steps to individual owners. So let's just take a look at this chart. So as we can see, these adaptations can happen across a variety of owners in your unique local context. Couple of key understandings. One, school and district curriculum leaders should keep the focus on grade level content and rigor, addressing learning gaps as needed within the context of grade level work. Second, TEKS is at the heart of a TEKS aligned RLA classroom, whether that classroom is in a building or virtual. Third, students may need more scaffolding this year to be able to access grade level text from home. So be intentional about building that space into your scope and sequence, prioritizing depth of instruction over pace. And finally, all of the reading research and HB3 tell us that a solid foundational skills program is a non-negotiable. Let's get Texas students learning to read in those early grades. And finally, to close us out, if you choose to go the adaptation route, you'll want to collect input from stakeholders around what worked and what didn't in the spring, determine those priority units and text within those units, identify a plan for unfinished learning, determine a plan for instructional setting and ensuring access to appropriate virtual scaffolds if necessary, and then finally, communicating to stakeholders and training teachers and leaders on those adaptations. And as a reminder, we have 2 upcoming webinars coming up, both at 10 a.m. Central. One this Wednesday on adapting or adopting science and social studies curricula for remote settings. And then on Friday, we'll dive more deeply into implementing Texas Home Learning 3.0. And I know we had a couple of questions come in. I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to lead us through some Q&A.
Great, thank you, Brian. If you have any questions at this point about adapting your current materials for RLA, which includes ELAR and SLAR materials, or adopting new high quality instructional materials specifically for RLA, we ask that you place those in the Q&A at this point. We will again have time in a moment to transition it over to TEA to share more about Texas Home Learning. I know we've been able to answer a lot of questions already through the Q&A, but if there are any additional ones at this point, feel free to put them in. Question just came in about, can we provide the link to the Strong Start page? Yes, we can put that in the chat right now. Another question came in about whether or not future webinars would cover early childhood or pre-K. We did cover pre-K in module 2, and you can find the recording and the materials for that webinar on TEA's Strong Start webpage. Getting a few questions in about let's see here. Getting a couple of questions here that are specific to supports that would be provided by TEA. And so we're gonna make note of those and pass those on so that we can get a response to you later on. A couple of questions about whether or not the materials that will be posted online will also include the notes from today. There will be a recording, so you can go directly to a certain point in the recording to hear the voiceover and any of the notes in case that would be helpful for you. Seeing a question here about the best way to work with students on their writing skills during distance learning. I'm going to pass that all over to Christina to share her thinking around that.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think the best way to work with students on their writing skills during distance learning is if your school system can leverage things like Google Docs, where students can continue to collaborate on their learning, on their writing. I'm not sure what grade band we're talking about, but let's say we're talking about grades 3 and up. If students can still mimic some of the things that would happen in in-person learning, where they have the opportunity to see a skill, an author's craft happening in a text that they're reading as a model example, and then practice that skill together with a classmate, either in a Google Doc or maybe the teacher's sharing screen if you're using Zoom, or if you're using Google Hangout or Schoology. The teachers and the students are, the teachers modeling it and the students are practicing that skill together. And then the student is able to practice that skill independently in a way that the student can share that writing with the teacher. Again, maybe that's in a Google Doc or via Schoology or in an email. And then the student is able to apply that skill to an authentic piece of writing where the student is responding to a prompt that's tied to the text, perhaps like an opinion piece or an expository piece about the text, so that the process that the student goes through in that they are seeing the skill in a text that they're using, they're practicing the skill with a partner or with the teacher, they're practicing the skill independently, but maybe not in an authentic piece of text, and then they're practicing the skill in an authentic writing. That process doesn't change, but maybe how students do that virtually might change. So we think about how we can leverage the tools that we have at our disposal, depending on what's available in your district. Google Docs is ideal because the teacher can be in there with the students commenting on the students' work as they're working, and students can share their writing together. So I don't think the process is going to change. We still want students to see what's happening when a published author is using that skill, and then be able to try to tackle that skill on their own. We just want to see what kind of virtual tools we can use to leverage that process.
Thank you, Christina. A couple of questions have come in about addressing unfinished learning both virtually and also just like doing that inside the context of the grade level work. And we all know that the RLA standards, ELAR and SLAR standards are intentionally redundant and recursive so that we can truly do that type of work inside of our grade level. Christina, do you have any specific, a specific example of a moment where a teacher might be addressing unfinished learning inside of the grade level standard?
Yeah, so we don't want to dip back into the standards to try to reteach something that we think students may have missed. What's always going to happen, and what's kind of the neat thing about RLA, is that the text is always going to demand what standards we are teaching. And so if the text is, I'm trying to think of an example on the spot now, if the text is demanding that we teach, is heavy in foreshadowing, for example, and you are a 10th grade teacher and know that students should have already examined foreshadowing in text many times before this, that's a great opportunity to teach foreshadowing to your kids when they get to a text where foreshadowing is a prominent literary thing happening in the text. But we're not going to start off the school year in 10th grade with a list of literary devices that authors might be using in anticipation of things that kids probably didn't know or didn't remember from previous years. We're going to wait and see what is the text demand that students need to know, and then we're going to teach kids as those things come up in the text, rather than teaching them what we think might come up during the school year. So RLA is kind of neat in that way because we don't have to, there really isn't a skill that a kid needs to know right away at the beginning of the school year, because the text is going to dictate what kids need to know as we work our way through the text. Main idea is another example. We can't assume that kids don't know how to identify main idea, so we're going to give them a bunch of practice with main idea in a text at the beginning of the year. It's probably not main idea that 8th graders can't do. It's probably I can't identify the main idea in a grade level complex text. So we're going to work with kids on how to identify main idea in this text in the way in which this author reveals it, which might be different than the way another author reveals it. So just thinking about what does this text demand, and that's how I determine what is my priority standards for this text and for this moment in time with these students.
Great, thank you so much, Christina, for that answer, and hope that that was helpful to folks. At this point, we've got a couple other questions that have come in that we will make sure to note and get responses for you at a later date from TEA, specifically around timeline for, it looks like for Texas Home Learning, which we are about to get an overview of, as well as some thoughts about guided reading and independent reading. So this way I'm going to transition it over to our partners at TEA to share more. Actually, before we do that, we would love your feedback on our time together today, this specific time on adopting or adapting RLA materials. If you would take just a brief moment to either pull up the link that was just chatted into the chat, or use your QR code scanner to scan the QR code that you see here on the screen. It would be really greatly beneficial for us to have some feedback from today so that we can continue ensuring that these webinars are of value to each of you as we move forward in the modules. All right, and now with that, I will transition it over to, I believe, Dana, who will share an overview of Texas Home Learning 3.0.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yes, I'm happy to be able to provide a high-level overview of Texas Home Learning 3.0, and I will go through that quickly because I see that there are still some questions in the chat. So I'll make sure I give us an overview and some time to answer some more questions. You can go on ahead to the next slide. So Texas Home Learning is a freely available, optional, aligned suite of resources that educators can use fully, in part, or not at all to support this new learning environment that we all find ourselves in. Texas Home Learning 3.0 includes 3 parts: the curriculum, the technology, and the professional development. I'm going to give an overview of each of those, and I'm going to be able to dive more deeply into the LMS, the Learning Management System. So the curriculum is for several content areas, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, all aligned, of course, to the TEKS, or the Texas Pre-Kindergarten Guidelines, and specifically adapted for our current learning environment. I know we're all making decisions right now, and it's a very tight timeline. I cannot yet share the specific curriculum or give a preview of the curricular materials, but it is coming very soon. The technology tools included in Texas Home Learning is a full learning management system designed to support student engagement and instructional collaboration, and we will find out more details about that in just a moment. And the professional development included in Texas Home Learning will support educators with implementation of either the curriculum or the technology. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that Texas Home Learning includes several subject areas, but not all grade levels. So I want to make sure that we understand what will be available. So there'll be a full pre-kindergarten curriculum available as part of Texas Home Learning, which is an integrated across all content areas. Math is available through 12th grade. ELAR is available through 12th grade, and that includes foundational skills in phonics in kindergarten through 2nd grade. SLAR is through 5th grade, and science and social studies are through 5th grade. And if you're thinking about what's included in Texas Home Learning, it really is a comprehensive package. So every grade level and subject area includes unit plans and full daily lesson plans aligned to our standards, built-in progress monitoring, digital format as well as printing capability. I know from the spring that access to digital was a big concern and remains a concern. So there is a printable component of Texas Home Learning, formative and summative unit assessments, teacher, student, and family supports, and then built-in accessibility supports for all learners. Moving on to the technology component of Texas Home Learning 3.0, we can announce that we've made a partnership for a 2-year license with Schoology. Districts must begin using Schoology anytime between today and March 1st, 2021 to benefit from this license. The learning management system allows for integration with existing platforms, forthcoming Texas Home Learning resources, and other products that you might be using at your district. And if you currently already have a Schoology account or contract, you can pause it to benefit from the additional 2 years of the learning management system provided by this TEA license. And implementation support for using the LMS will be available from TEA, Schoology, and from our Education Service Center staff. And if you are interested in learning more about the Schoology partnership, you can go ahead to the link at the bottom of the screen, powerschool.com/Texas. And the last component of Texas Home Learning is ongoing professional development. We know that the best tools are most effective with the best supports. So we're seeking to provide some implementation supports on both the instructional materials that are part of Texas Home Learning 3.0 and on the learning management system. So there's much more information to come on that, but also we'll name that Education Service Centers will support implementation and training for Texas Home Learning 3.0, whether you decide to adopt the curriculum, the learning management system, both, or of course, optional to adopt none. So that's a high-level overview of Texas Home Learning. I'm going to go quickly back to the Q&A so I can get as many questions answered as possible. Will there be a scope and sequence for the core content areas in Texas Home Learning 3.0? yes, there will be a scope and sequence for each content area provided as part of Texas Home Learning 3.0. Getting lots of questions about when the curriculum will be available. I wish I had a better answer than it's coming very soon, and the best place to go is the instructional continuity page of the Texas Education Agency website to get the most up-to-date information. We'll also be making announcements on the superintendent calls as soon as that information is available. We're closing out some contracts to make sure we can share that information as soon as possible. And similar answer, when will teachers have access to professional learning? So we're working to get the professional development supports available as soon as possible, as soon as the curriculum is available, so that you'd be able to support understanding the curriculum and implementing it as soon as we'll have the curriculum available. Let's see. I got a question earlier about, will TEA continue to offer free access to Myon? So Renaissance Myon is an online digital library that we included as part of earlier Texas Home Learning 1.0 and 2.0, and it was available freely during distance learning in the spring and the summer. That partnership has ended, I think, as of July 31st. So if that's something that you're interested in continuing, you would have to work as a district directly with Myon to make that available. Let's see. Lots of great questions. Got some questions about some ESC questions. Let me try to answer those. How will ESCs support districts and teachers, and how will ESCs be trained? So there's a lot more information to come on that. We're actually looking forward to partnering really closely with Education Service Center staff to help us define the best supports that are needed at districts. And so we're working to make sure that we're collaborating with Education Service Center staff to define that. So we'll have a lot more information to share on that. Got a question, will curriculum for grade 8 science and social studies be developed? Currently, we only have K-5 science and social studies curriculum included as part of Texas Home Learning. There's always a possibility to add more options in the future, but right now we only have the K-5 science and social studies curricula. Got a question about, will ESCs have free access to Schoology as well? I know this question has been raised already, so our team is already working on that answer. I don't have that answer today, but we are aware of that question and working on it. Let's see. Got a question, is this curriculum aligned to grade level needs or based on selected texts? Or, so I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's aligned to our grade level TEKS, of course, and our grade level standards. And the text would be, for ELAR or SLAR, would be in service of meeting those grade level TEKS. It's a question, are there any suggestions for providing guided reading, virtual guided reading, also about self-selected reading? I'm gonna see if we have a minute for anyone on the Instruction Partners team. Do you have any suggestions on virtual guided reading or self-selected reading?
Yeah, so for, I'll take the virtual guided reading one first. And I'm going to use my son's school as an example. One thing that she did that worked really well in the spring, they originally had, he's in 2nd grade, they originally had a whole group virtual instruction scheduled, and that was it. And then she quickly realized that was not going to work for second graders. And then she broke out her small group reading groups. And so he was able to meet with his small reading group twice a week with just the teacher and a few other kids. But what was nice about it was, and what should happen during guided reading in a virtual setting or in the classroom, is that the grade level complex text should still be at the center of instruction. And that opportunity to meet with those small groups of students should be to provide scaffolds that will support those students in accessing that grade level text that their peers are and their classmates are also accessing. So I think when you think about it virtually, if there's a way that you can build out opportunities for small groups of kids to meet with the teacher, that worked out really well in my son's case, but I don't know if that's always going to be the case for classrooms, but that did work out really well. And the second question about independent reading,
unfortunately, I'm so sorry, Christina, but we are going to have to pause because we are at 11 o'clock. But thank you so much. We're going to work to get any additional questions from the Q&A answered. And please check the Strong Start page later today or at the latest tomorrow to get the recording and materials from this session. Thank you all for your participation, for everything that you do for students across Texas, and have a wonderful day.